the colonial commander who lost every battle and broke the British Army anyway. But here is what nobody tells you about Nathanael Greene, and I mean nobody. The real victory was not won on any battlefield. It was won in the minds of his officers, in the calculations of his supply chain, and in the deliberate engineering of a military machine that made defeat itself a weapon. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand how a general can lose every single battle and still fundamentally reshape the entire course of a war. That is the secret hiding inside Greene's genius, and it changes everything you think you know about military victory. If you have been following this channel, you know that military history is full of commanders who are celebrated for winning battles that turned out to matter very little. But Greene operated on a completely different principle, and I want you to subscribe right now if you appreciate stories about outsiders who rewrote the rules of warfare, because that is exactly what you are going to see here. Also, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever faced a situation where losing felt like winning, or where someone told you that you failed, but the outcome said something entirely different? Greene's entire campaign is built on that paradox, and I know you have a story like that too. Now wait, this part is important, and I need your full attention for a moment. What we are talking about here is not just a military campaign. It is a complete inversion of how command works, how strategy operates, and how an army can achieve its objectives without winning the traditional way. If you want to understand the actual mechanisms behind Greene's approach, the supply calculations, the force multiplication tactics, the psychological warfare hidden inside his orders, we have created a complete in-depth guide that breaks down every layer of his strategy. It is available in the description, and I have pinned it in the comments as well. This is not something I can fully cover in 8 minutes, but the guide will show you exactly how he did it. Nathanael Greene was born in 1742 in Potawatomi, Rhode Island, a place most people have never heard of and could not find on a map. His family ran a forge and an iron foundry. Working people, practical people, people who built things for a living. But his father was also a Quaker preacher, which means Greene grew up in a household that was fundamentally opposed to war, to violence, to the entire machinery of military conflict. Quakers did not serve in militias. They did not study tactics. They did not believe that any cause, no matter how righteous, justified taking a human life. Yet Nathanael could not stop reading about warfare. He would smuggle military texts into the family home. He traded for them. He studied the campaigns of Julius Caesar and Frederick the Great in secret, reading by candlelight when his father thought he was studying scripture. He taught himself geometry because he understood that every fortification, every cannon placement, every defensive position was built on mathematical principles. He read everything available on siege warfare, on army movement, on supply lines. While other boys his age were learning trades, Nathanael Greene was absorbing military knowledge at a depth that most actual officers in the British Army never reached. By 1775, when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, he had never commanded a single soldier, never heard a cannon fire, and never set foot on a battlefield. But his mind was already a general's mind. There was something else about Greene, though, something that most military officers would have considered disqualifying. He walked with a pronounced limp. Historians still debate the exact cause. Some say it was a stiff knee from birth, others claim an old injury from the forge. But the simple fact was that Nathanael Greene did not move like a soldier. He could not cut an imposing figure on horseback. He could not march at the front of his columns with the posture and bearing that 18th century armies expected from their commanders. In a world where the look of leadership mattered enormously, where officers were expected to embody physical strength and martial bearing, Greene was fundamentally wrong for the job. When he finally enlisted in 1775, he did not take a commission as a captain or colonel, the way someone with his education and understanding might have expected. He enlisted as a private. He was a man who had spent years studying military strategy at a level that most actual serving officers had never approached, and he started as the lowest rank in the Continental Army. His own Quaker community nearly expelled him for attending a military parade. Everything about his background, his physiology, his faith, and his social position suggested that he had no business being anywhere near a war. And yet, within 5 years, he would be given command of the entire southern theater of the American Revolution. The path to the South was paved with loss. By 1778, Greene had seen combat at Princeton, Long Island, and Brandywine. He had learned to fight in the snow at Valley Forge, where Washington's army nearly collapsed from cold and hunger. He had watched disciplined British forces outmaneuver Continental militia. He had been captured, exchanged, and sent back to the line. Every battle had taught him something, but more importantly, every failure had taught him something. And that is the turning point you need to understand. Greene was not learning how to win battles in the conventional sense. He was learning how to wage war in an unconventional way, using the exact circumstances that made him an underdog as his greatest tactical advantage. By the time he arrived in the South in December 1780, everything was burning. Charleston had fallen. Savannah was under British control. The Continental Army in the region had been shattered. Greene's predecessor, Baron von Steuben, had warned him that the situation was nearly hopeless. The soldiers were starving, many had already deserted. The government could send no supplies, no money, no reinforcements. The British controlled nearly every significant population center, every supply depot, every fortress. Greene was being asked to take command of a defeated, desperate army in a theater that seemed already lost, and he accepted without hesitation. Now, you might expect that what happened next was a series of battles where Greene figured out how to defeat the British and restore American control of the South. That is the story most people tell about the Southern campaign, but that is not what actually happened, and that is where the real genius emerges. Greene fought the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill and lost. He fought the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, one of the largest engagements of the entire war, and lost. He fought the Battle of Eutaw Springs and lost. One battle after another, Nathanael Greene took his army into combat against the British, and he did not win the conventional way. The British held the field. The Americans withdrew. By every traditional measure of military success, Greene was failing. But something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface. Something that the British command did not fully understand until it was far too late to change course. Every battle Greene lost cost the British soldiers and supplies they could not replace. The British were fighting 10,000 miles from home, dependent on supply ships that took months to cross the Atlantic. Every casualty, every musket lost, every cannon damaged was a permanent reduction in their strength. Greene, meanwhile, was fighting on his home territory. When he withdrew, he was retreating toward supply depots, toward friendly populations, toward territory where he could rebuild and prepare for the next engagement. The British were advancing deeper into hostile country, spreading their forces thinner and thinner across the Carolina landscape, trying to hold territory that they did not have enough soldiers to actually control. This is the secret that Greene understood and most of his contemporaries did not. You can lose every battle and still win the war if you make your losses so expensive for the enemy that they cannot afford to keep fighting. Every time Greene engaged the British, he chose the terrain. He chose the positioning. He forced them to attack him on ground of his selection, ground where his smaller force could inflict maximum casualties. Then, when the British pushed him back, he withdrew in good order, regrouped, found new terrain, and did it again. The British would report victories to London. They held the field at Hobkirk's Hill, they held the field at Guilford Courthouse, they held the field at Eutaw Springs, but with each victory, they were losing more soldiers. With each battle, their ability to control the territory behind them was deteriorating. Greene was not trying to win the war in the traditional way. He was trying to break the British Army's capacity to wage war at all. This strategy, what historians now call the war of attrition through tactical retreat, was not born from weakness. It was born from cold mathematics. Greene understood something fundamental about how empires conduct war across oceans. Every redcoat killed in the Carolinas had to be replaced by a man shipped across the Atlantic, fed, equipped, and supplied over thousands of miles of hostile water. Every musket lost meant another pulled from British arsenals in London and Bristol. Every casualty that did not result in a decisive American surrender was a wound that would not heal. The British commander, Lord Cornwallis, believed he was chasing a fleeing army. In reality, he was being hunted. After Guilford Courthouse, in March of 1781, something shifted in the Southern theater. Cornwallis realized that holding ground meant nothing if his army was bleeding out while doing it. He made a decision that would change everything. He would march north into Virginia, link up with British forces there, and attempt to consolidate control over a smaller territory more thoroughly. It seemed logical. It was, in fact, a catastrophe, because Greene did not chase Cornwallis north. Instead, he turned south, toward the interior of South Carolina and Georgia. What Cornwallis had just done was abandon the western Carolinas to Greene's control, and Greene moved through that territory like a restorer reclaiming his own house. He did not have to fight major battles anymore. He had British garrisons scattered across the region, small forts, isolated outposts, and they were trapped. They could not communicate with each other, they could not reinforce each other, they could barely supply themselves. One by one, Greene's forces surrounded them, cut them off, and forced them to surrender or be starved into submission. By the summer of 1781, the British held only Charleston and Savannah along the entire coast. Everything else, every town, every district, every plantation, belonged to the Americans again. Cornwallis, marching north toward what he hoped would be reinforcement and victory, found himself instead at a place called Yorktown, Virginia, and there, trapped between an American force commanded by George Washington and a French fleet that had cut off his escape by sea, he would surrender his entire army in October of 1781. But here's what most textbooks miss. Yorktown was not the real victory in the South. Yorktown was the exclamation point. The actual triumph had already happened in the Carolinas. Before we continue deeper into what comes after, I need to make sure you understand the full blueprint of how Greene actually accomplished this. The complete strategic breakdown, the positioning principles, the casualty calculations, the supply line manipulation. All of it is explained in exhaustive detail in our strategic guide, available in the description and pinned comment. That guide walks you through the exact mechanisms Greene used to turn losses into victories, the way he read his opponent's limitations, and how he positioned retreat as a winning move. If you want to understand the tactical genius behind this campaign on a level most commanders never reach, that is where to go. But what happened to Greene after the war tells you everything about how little America remembered its heroes. The British were gone, the colonies were independent, and Nathanael Greene, who had held the South together through impossible odds, who had reorganized a shattered army and turned it into a weapon of endurance, was discharged with almost nothing. Congress owed him money. They owed the soldiers money. The government had no funds to pay them. Greene spent years fighting to get the compensation that was owed to him and the men who had served under him. He eventually received a small land grant in Georgia as partial payment. He moved south, tried to establish a plantation, and attempted to rebuild a life from nothing. But his health had been broken by the war. The years of sleeping on frozen ground, marching without adequate food, enduring the constant pressure of command in an impossible situation, all of it had taken its toll. In June of 1786, Nathanael Greene died at his plantation. He was only 44 years old. Most of America barely noticed. Most Americans did not even know who he was. Yet the officers and soldiers who served with him understood what he had accomplished. George Washington understood. When the Marquis de Lafayette visited Greene's grave years later, he wept. He said that Greene had been the savior of the southern states. And he was right. Without Greene's campaign in the Carolinas, without his understanding that wars are not won in individual battles but through the systematic degradation of an enemy's capacity to wage war, the outcome of the revolution might have been very different. Here is the deeper reality that changed how the entire world thought about military strategy. Greene proved that the weaker force does not have to match the stronger force's power directly. Instead, the weaker force can shape the terrain of the conflict itself. The weaker force can choose where to fight, when to fight, and crucially, when not to fight. The weaker force can make victory so expensive that it becomes defeat. This principle did not die with Greene. It echoed forward through history. It appeared in the American Civil War, where Union generals like William Tecumseh Sherman understood that an army is not just soldiers and guns, it is an organism that requires constant feeding, constant supply, constant replacement of losses. It appeared in the 20th century in the campaigns of T.E. Lawrence in the Middle East, in the strategies of counterinsurgency and asymmetric warfare. Every modern military academy teaches Greene's lesson now, though many do not credit him by name. The principle is simple. You do not win wars by being stronger than your enemy. You win wars by making your enemy weaker than they can afford to be. And in the case of Nathanael Greene, you do this by standing and fighting on terrain of your choosing, inflicting maximum casualties, and then withdrawing in good order to fight again tomorrow. The British could claim to have won every battle, but Greene won the one war that mattered. The tragedy is that history compressed Greene into a footnote. When Americans think of Revolutionary War generals, they think of George Washington. When they think of military genius, they think of names that Hollywood has made famous. Greene's name has faded. His story has been buried beneath the more dramatic narratives of battles won and dramatic last stands. But for those who actually understand strategy, for military historians, for officers who have studied war seriously, Greene stands as one of the clearest examples of how mind can defeat muscle, how patience can defeat aggression, and how a man with almost nothing can break an empire that seemed unbreakable. The question that historians have wrestled with for nearly 250 years is not whether Greene was brilliant. That is settled. The question is why America forgot him so thoroughly. Why did a general who saved the southern states become a name that even many history teachers have never heard of? Part of the answer is that Greene won the wrong kind of victory. He did not win the kind of victory that gets carved into monuments or painted in massive canvases for grand halls. He won through exhaustion, through systematic degradation, through attrition. He won by losing. And Americans, in their heart, have always preferred heroes who win decisively, who triumph in glorious moments, who defeat their enemies in clear-cut confrontations. But that preference is itself a kind of blindness, because the real genius of strategy is not about being the strongest or the most aggressive. The real genius is understanding the actual mathematics of conflict. It is understanding that every enemy soldier has a family somewhere expecting him to come home. It is understanding that every lost supply convoy means fewer uniforms, fewer muskets, fewer opportunities to maintain control. It is understanding that time is a weapon if you know how to use it. Greene understood something that most commanders of his era refused to accept. The American cause would not be lost on any single battlefield. It would be lost if the army stopped existing. So every decision he made, every retreat, every seeming defeat, every calculated withdrawal, was designed with one objective in mind: keep the army alive, keep it moving, keep it dangerous. After the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill in April of 1781, when Greene was forced to retreat once again from a numerically superior force under Colonel Francis Rawdon, something remarkable happened in the British command structure. They realized they had won a battle but were losing a war. Rawdon himself became so frustrated with the endless cycle of pursuit that led nowhere, that exhausted his own men without destroying the enemy, that he requested relief and returned to England. He had beaten Greene in combat, but Greene had defeated the British strategy. Meanwhile, Greene's scattered forces were consolidating in the backcountry. He was receiving reinforcements from militia units in North Carolina and South Carolina. The British, meanwhile, were stretched thinner and thinner across their occupied territories. They held Charleston, they held Savannah, but the countryside belonged to nobody, or rather, it belonged to Greene's army, because Greene had learned to make the landscape itself part of his strategy. He worked with local militia commanders who understood the terrain in ways that British regulars could never match. He coordinated with riders and scouts who could move across hostile country, gathering intelligence, disrupting supply lines, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. This was not conventional warfare as Europe understood it. This was something different. This was the kind of war that could only be won in America, by Americans who knew the land and understood that conventional armies could not survive without the infrastructure of logistics. The British were winning battles. Greene was winning something far more valuable. He was winning the confidence of the Southern population. Every time Cornwallis or Rawdon or any British commander defeated Greene on the battlefield, they did so while their army grew smaller and more exhausted. Every time Greene retreated, he left behind the impression that American resistance was not crushed, that the Continental Army could absorb punishment and keep fighting. In the South, that kind of persistence, that refusal to break, no matter how many times you were knocked down, that was becoming a form of moral victory. And Greene was cultivating relationships with every militia commander, every governor, every influential figure in the Carolinas who could help him. He was doing something that very few commanders in that war ever attempted. He was turning military strategy into political strategy. He was making the British occupiers look like invaders, which, of course, they were. And he was making the American forces, despite their defeats and hardships, look like the Army of Liberation. His letters from this period reveal a man who understood the full scope of what he was trying to accomplish. He was not just trying to defeat the British Army. He was trying to make the British realize that holding the South was costing them more than they could afford. He was trying to make the home government in London understand that a military victory meant nothing if it bankrupted the nation and turned the population against you. The next major engagement came in September of 1781 at Eutaw Springs. Once again, Greene was outnumbered. Once again, he positioned his forces carefully. Militia in front to absorb the initial shock, regulars behind them to exploit any opening. Once again, the battle was close, brutal, and inconclusive. Greene was forced to withdraw. The British claimed victory. And yet, after Eutaw Springs, the British army in the South was so badly damaged that it could no longer conduct offensive operations. This is where the strategy becomes crystalline. Greene had fought 5 major engagements in the Carolinas. He had lost every single one of them: Hobkirk's Hill, Camden, Guilford Courthouse, Eutaw Springs, and others. But each loss had whittled away at British strength. Each retreat had extended British supply lines. Each engagement had cost the British soldiers they could not replace and resources they could not replenish. Meanwhile, something was happening in Virginia that would prove decisive. Lord Cornwallis, frustrated by his inability to destroy Greene and unable to control the countryside around him, had marched north toward Virginia. He was hoping to cut off American forces there and link up with British operations in the Chesapeake. But this decision, moving away from the lower South, left that entire region open to Greene's continued influence. And at Yorktown in October of 1781, Cornwallis found himself trapped by an American and French force under Washington. Cornwallis surrendered. The British general who had defeated Greene repeatedly, who had won battles against him, who had occupied South Carolina and Georgia, he surrendered because he had been drawn away from the South by the realization that he could never defeat Greene by conventional means. The man who could not win a single battle in the South had, through his strategic genius, forced the British commander into a position where he had to risk everything in Virginia, and that risk cost Britain the war. But the war did not end at Yorktown, not officially. Fighting continued in the South. Greene continued to operate, and it was his presence, his unbroken army, his control of the countryside that made it clear to the British that holding the Carolinas was no longer strategically viable. When negotiators sat down to hammer out the Treaty of Paris in 1782 and 1783, one of the key issues was the status of the southern colonies. The British, facing an army they could not defeat, not in battles, but in the larger contest of wills and resources, agreed to terms that effectively ceded the entire region to American control. Greene never won the battle, but he won the South, and in doing so, he won the war. Before we continue, I need you to keep something in mind for just a moment. What you are watching right now, this narrative of a man who understood that losing battles is sometimes part of winning wars, this is the surface of something far deeper. The actual mechanics of how Greene constructed his strategy, how he managed logistics under impossible conditions, how he coordinated militia with regulars, how he used terrain and psychology and timing to create situations where the British had no good options, all of that, the real operational blueprints, they are explained in exhaustive detail in the comprehensive guide available in the description and pinned in the comments. This ebook goes far beyond what I can cover here in the video. It includes maps, detailed timelines, primary source analysis, and the strategic frameworks that Greene used. If you want to understand not just what happened, but how it happened and why it worked, that guide is where you will find the keys to the entire system. It is a paid resource, but it is where the real depth lies. Now, there is something else about Nathanael Greene that needs to be understood, something that separates him from other commanders of his era and shows why his approach was not just militarily brilliant, but historically necessary. Greene was not a product of the European military establishment. He did not come through the academies. He did not bring with him the rigid orthodoxies of Frederick the Great or the conventions of European line warfare. He had studied those traditions, yes, but he had studied them as an outsider studying rules he could choose to break. He understood that America was not Europe, that an army of colonial militia and continental regulars operating in swamps and forests and mountains could not fight the way Prussian armies fought on open plains, that victory in America required thinking like an American, not thinking like a European officer transplanted to a foreign landscape. This was the insight that made him dangerous. While other American generals were trying to imitate European warfare, trying to match the British army in its own game, Greene understood that America's greatest strength was that it was not Europe. It was wilder. It was less organized. It offered opportunities for commanders who could think asymmetrically, who could operate without the rigid supply chains that kept European armies tethered to their bases. He incorporated militia into his campaigns in ways that European generals considered almost disrespectful. He did not treat militia as inferior to regulars. He positioned them strategically. He used their strengths, their knowledge of terrain, their ability to move quickly, their understanding of local support networks, and he protected them from their weaknesses. A militia unit in the hands of a general who understood their nature could be as valuable as a regular regiment. This approach horrified European observers, but it worked. And it worked because Greene had grasped something fundamental. In a war for independence, the population itself is part of the strategy. Every militia member fighting in South Carolina was someone from that region. Their families lived there, their neighbors knew them. When they fought for Greene, they were not fighting as mercenaries or conscripts. They were fighting for their own land, their own futures, their own families. And Greene understood that this gave them a kind of motivation that no amount of European drill and discipline could generate. When a British soldier was defeated and captured, he became a prisoner of war, a resource that the British had already written off. When a militia member was defeated, he went home. His neighbors knew he had fought. His reputation in the community was affected. And the next time Greene called for volunteers, those neighbors remembered that he had asked them to fight, and they came. This is what many military histories miss about Greene. They focus on the battles. They count the casualties. They mark on maps where the armies were positioned. But they miss the fact that Greene was not just fighting a military war, he was fighting a political and social war. He was making it increasingly costly for the British to maintain control of the South, not just in military terms, but in economic terms, in terms of the willingness of the local population to cooperate with occupation authorities. Every time a British general had to requisition supplies from the local population, he was confirming to that population that they were living under occupation. Every time a British garrison had to garrison a town, they were demonstrating that they could not control the countryside. Every time they suffered a defeat, even a tactical defeat in battle, it was a reminder to the colonists that resistance was possible, that the British could be bloodied, that independence was not a fantasy. Greene also understood something about command that many generals never grasp, that the appearance of control is part of actual control. When he coordinated with Daniel Morgan, the brilliant cavalry tactician, at Cowpens, Greene was not diminishing his own authority. He was multiplying his effectiveness. When he worked with Francis Marion, the swamp fox, operating in the backcountry of South Carolina, he was extending his reach into terrain where regular forces could not effectively operate. When he coordinated with Thomas Sumter and the militia forces across the Carolinas, he was creating a network of resistance that the British could not possibly suppress. This was not weakness on Greene's part. This was the recognition that in a war where the entire population is potentially part of the fighting force, the best general is not the one who tries to control everything personally, but the one who creates the conditions where local commanders and militia leaders can be effective. Greene set the strategy. Greene defined the operational area and the objectives, but he allowed men like Morgan and Marion to execute that strategy in ways that made sense for their specific circumstances. After Yorktown, after Cornwallis surrendered, the British still held Charleston and Savannah, but Greene knew that holding coastal cities meant nothing if the countryside belonged to his army. He pressed his advantage. He harassed British supply lines. He coordinated with militia to make British operations outside the garrison towns progressively more dangerous. And slowly, methodically, he demonstrated to the British High Command that the cost of maintaining those garrisons far exceeded any strategic benefit they provided. In December of 1782, the British evacuated Savannah. By the spring of 1783, as the Treaty of Paris was being finalized, the British also evacuated Charleston. Greene entered the city not as a conqueror of a defeated enemy, but as the liberator of a territory that had been under occupation. He had lost every major battle. He had never achieved a decisive victory in conventional military terms, but he had liberated the southern colonies from British control through a strategy of attrition, resilience, and the intelligent use of every resource available to him, including the will of the local population to resist occupation. This is the moment that changes everything. Greene dismounts and walks through the city he had fought for without winning a single battle to defend it. And standing there, watching soldiers embrace families they had not seen in 3 years, watching merchants reopen their shops, watching children play in streets no longer patrolled by red-coated sentries. This is when the full weight of what he had accomplished becomes clear. The British did not leave Charleston because they had been defeated by superior force. They left because staying there cost more than leaving. They left because an entire region had been turned against occupation through attrition. They left because Greene had proven something that most military academies would not teach for another 100 years, that you do not have to win battles to win wars. And here is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The reason Nathanael Greene succeeded where officers with more conventional training might have failed is not because he was a better tactician in the traditional sense. It is because he understood something that most career soldiers did not. That war is not just about what happens on the battlefield. War is about economics. War is about the will of the enemy to continue fighting. War is about the cost of occupation versus the benefit of holding ground. Greene studied theory so intensely as a young man not to master the grand maneuver or the perfect battle formation. It was to understand the deeper principles that govern why armies move, why nations fight, and when they decide to stop. A conventional general might have thrown his starving, barefoot army at the British fortifications in a desperate attempt to break them through sheer force. A conventional general might have accepted the narrative that his 9 losses meant his strategic approach had failed. But Greene understood that every battle he lost weakened the British position in a different way. Every time he drew the British out from their fortifications, he forced them to spend resources they could not replace. Every time he retreated in good order, he preserved an army that could fight again tomorrow. Every engagement, even in defeat, extracted a price from the British that compounded over months and years. General Henry Clinton, commanding the British forces from New York, would later write in his official reports that the Southern campaign under Nathanael Greene represented the most costly campaign of the entire war, not in terms of British victories, but in terms of British resources expended for diminishing returns. Clinton had expected Greene to break. Officers with fresh supplies and full-strength regiments typically did break under the strain of continuous maneuver and repeated defeats. But Greene did not break. His army did not break. The southern colonies did not break. And by refusing to break, by continuing to maneuver, by continuing to threaten, by continuing to believe that tomorrow might bring a different outcome, he eventually broke the British will to continue occupying the South. This is something that gets lost in most histories of the Revolutionary War. We remember Yorktown. We remember Washington at Valley Forge. We remember the heroic victories that made headlines and inspired monuments. But the campaign that arguably did more to force British withdrawal from the American South, a campaign fought by a man who never won a major battle, is often treated as a footnote. Greene's 9 defeats are mentioned, but the strategic genius that turned those defeats into a winning strategy is rarely examined with the depth it deserves. He is overshadowed by Washington's more dramatic victories, by the mythology of the Valley Forge winter, by the emotional power of Yorktown. Yet, in the decades after the war, every serious military strategist understood what Greene had accomplished. The Prussian officers who studied American revolutionary tactics saw in Greene's campaign the blueprint for maneuver warfare, the understanding that destroying the enemy's ability to wage war could be more important than destroying the enemy's armies. Napoleon strategists examined Greene's methods. British military theorists at Sandhurst debated his approach. By the time the Civil War broke out in America, the principles Greene had pioneered, strategic maneuver, attrition, the intelligent use of terrain and supply lines, were being taught as advanced military theory. Greene died in 1786, just 3 years after the war ended, worn out by the strain of years of constant campaigning. He was 52 years old, but his body had endured more than most men could have survived. He never received the same recognition as Washington. There are fewer statues of Nathanael Greene in American cities than there are of almost any other major figure of the Revolution. His name is not woven into the national mythology the way the founding generals are. But among the people who understand military strategy, who have spent careers learning how to move armies, how to manage resources, how to pressure an enemy into submission without necessarily defeating them in decisive battle, Nathanael Greene is understood as one of the most brilliant minds the American military has ever produced. And perhaps most remarkably, Greene's approach has proven to be far more prescient than anyone could have imagined in 1783. In the 20th and 21st centuries, as conventional military power became less decisive in determining the outcome of wars, as insurgencies and occupations became more common than pitched battles between standing armies, as the economic and psychological elements of warfare became more important than the size of artillery batteries, the principles that Nathanael Greene pioneered became increasingly relevant. The commander who had to hold territory without overwhelming force, who had to make an occupying power decide that the cost of holding ground exceeded the benefit, who had to understand that sometimes the most important victory is simply surviving to fight another day. That commander's approach became the template for asymmetrical warfare. So what does this mean for you? What does the story of a man who lost every major battle but won his war tell us about how to approach our own challenges? Here is the takeaway. The most direct route to a goal is not always the winning route. Sometimes resilience matters more than a single dramatic victory. Sometimes understanding the deeper forces at work, the economics, the psychology, the long-term costs versus benefits of different approaches, matters more than conventional measures of success. Greene's genius was not that he had a better plan than his enemies. His genius was that he understood the landscape in which the plan had to operate. He understood his enemies' constraints. He understood what would break his enemy's will. And he understood that the victory that mattered was not the one that happened on a single battlefield, but the one that would last. The limp that he carried from his youth to his grave did not make him a less capable commander. In fact, it may have made him a better one. A man who had to move differently, who could not rely on the imposing figure of a mounted officer at the front of a cavalry charge, had to think differently about how wars were won. He had to develop a deeper, more cerebral approach to command. He had to understand that genius was not about looking like a general, it was about thinking like one. Nathanael Greene lost every major battle and broke the British Army anyway. And in doing so, he taught the world something that would reshape military thinking for the next 2 centuries. That victory is not always what it appears to be, and sometimes the greatest generals are the ones who know when not to fight. Thank you for watching this story with us. If you found yourself drawn to this forgotten commander and the principles he embodied, please subscribe to Unbroken Regiment and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next hero's story. Leave a comment below. Tell us which part of Greene's campaign struck you most, or share your own thoughts on what makes a true military genius. That conversation keeps these stories alive. We will see you on the next one. End of Part 4. Script complete.